I think it's a very exciting development. Now, this Mayor Walsh, his election was boosted by the arts community because a organization called Mass Creative, which is a lobbying organization for the arts in the state of Massachusetts, really turned out people to hear him talk and asked him a lot of questions about what he would do to further the arts in Boston. So he has been very attuned to the need to have leadership in the arts in his administration. Early in his administration, he appointed a commissioner of the arts, Julie Burrows, and she's been working on a larger plan for the city to have the arts be much more integrated into public policy. So this is their first announcement that they've made, and I think it's a really inventive one because artists are people who every day have to invent their work. They don't go in and have a list of people to call or go in and know they're going to be measuring the weather for the day. They really have to make it up with their imagination. So they often are sort of like magicians in our myths. They can see clearly because they're not in it. So I think having an artist in a public agency will actually ask a lot of questions and make people maybe think differently about the way they're delivering services. You know, years ago, the man who founded Polaroid Corporation here, which is now long gone, but it was instant photography, he would bring artists in, major artists like Ansel Adams. He would have them play with his products to ask questions about them. So I think that having the creative person who is engaged in using their imagination, looking at what we're doing, can very much freshen our thinking about how we're going about our services. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Maybe the snow removal will even become artistic. You know? Well, most of my life I've worked with artists, most of my professional life, and that program was an extension of the work I had done before with artists. At the museum, we invite people, our curator, I don't invite them personally, our curator really travels the world looking for people who are very talented, who may not be so well known yet, and who can benefit from a month to just think and dream and get supported for what they want to do, and then later to do a project. So we've had such an amazing array of people, from artists from Wales who use grass to make their imagery, and who while they were at the museum, developed some work that they then made and showed using a special kind of grass that they work with scientists to develop that relate to good ecological practices. So that this grass is also used for other things, but they used it to they would grow the grass on campuses and then through light exposures make their images, and when you stood far away you thought that it was actual paint. It was so beautifully done. So something from that extreme to people who have worked out new compositions, dance, fashion design. It's all a great body of work has come from that. I would really like to inspire students who are planning to go into government service, whether it's elected or in running agencies or being thinkers who are policy wonks who are developing public policies, to incorporate the arts much more into civic life. There's been too much of a pullback on the arts being integrated into our lives, whether it's removing them from the public school curricula, which has been a huge blow to people who don't get the opportunity to develop their ability to use their eyes to see more, or their ears to hear more, or even their talents that never get developed. So from public education to our cities and the way we design public spaces and use design for buildings that make for a more humane environment rather than maybe glass boxes lined up in a row, or even in bridge design or highway design. The arts are so integral to the shaping of everything we do as people, and yet we've really pulled back on educating people in them in America and making them a part of our lives. So I'm hoping to awaken people to the possibilities of that. I think it's not so much that as, but you know, it is interesting when you look at, for example, the kind of graphic design political campaigns use. It could be really put stuff to a higher level, but it's not so much about that as it is about thinking about making the arts a part of our life and policies that will do that. Oh, I think that's a very good question, and in fact, I'm bringing for one seminar Johan Grimmenpré, who is a filmmaker who has spent much of the last 10 years of his life making documentaries that try to expose the international arms trade and the corruption and the freewheeling of governments and arms dealers and the creation of what he calls the perpetual war. So through his filmmaking, he's trying to challenge this practice. But you have so much of this go, you know, for example, the Chinese artists that in the 80s and 90s began reflecting the practices of the Chinese government. And they were very involved in the whole Tiananmen Square outbreak. And in making in Tiananmen Square, they were making these objects. They made it, for example, they made an object that was sort of a send-off of the Statue of Liberty, only Chinese style. They did all kinds of things, so much so that many of them had to leave the country. I know one artist who was confined to his house for a year. So artists trying to reflect truth to political regimes has been something that has been in many countries a very important. But there's also the fact that regimes use artists often. For example, Hitler used Leni Riefenstahl to make films that just glorified him. And in fact, even today, we're still looking at her work and debating when is propaganda actually art. And Stalin harnessed the artist for his will, and the whole Soviet realism was a genre that we now look at today, and it as propaganda. So you can go through, you know, tyrants often have their artists who work for them and make messages and narratives to bend the public will to the tyrant's story. And but I think more often what we think of is artists that bring down regimes. And certainly even in Egypt, the street art that arose during the Arab Spring was quite remarkable. And exhibitions have been done on the street art in Cairo. Oh, yes. In fact, and often in the roles I have been in, you have to stand up for the freedom of expression in this country. You cannot let it pass. And so I have had situations where an artist, or in one case, an actual theatrical production, a leading political figure in Massachusetts called me and said he was going to call a press conference requiring that this theater event not happen and subtract the amount that the organization was getting from the State Arts Council, which I directed, from my budget. And I had to argue with him about it, which was very terrifying because he could just shut me down, basically. And I finally said to him, you know, have you seen this theater production? He said no. And I said, well, I haven't either, so let's both go together and see it. And then let's have a discussion about it, because if you do this, I have to oppose you, because it's my moral obligation to oppose you on it. I have to stand up for free speech. And much to my relief, he said, oh, okay, forget it, goodbye. but that was just luck, that he just didn't want to go through all this with me. But Massachusetts has been notorious for banning things. Banned in Boston is something that used to be typical. Books banned in Boston. Frederick Wiseman, who is now sort of one of our more revered filmmakers, had a film that he made, I think, in the 70s called Titicut Follies, which showed the abuse of prisoners in a prison in Walpole for the mentally insane. And it was banned in Massachusetts. You couldn't see it here. And now, of course, now you can see it. But so censorship is always with us. And look at Citizen 4 and Laura Poitras's recent piece. I mean, that which gives the Snowden story from Snowden. She's had great issues in getting her work out, including being followed by the FBI for 8 years. Not around that film, but around a film she made in Iraq a number of years ago. In fact, there's an exhibition of her work right now at the Whitney Museum in New York. I think that self-censorship is another problem, because institutions, museums, don't want to have big donors remove their funding, or artists, because they fear their work being censored. We feel now that there's a bit of a tameness about what's going on, because we're self-censoring ourselves. We're not as out there as we were in previous times. When the Berlin Wall came down, and when the Communist Party in the USSR collapsed, the forces in the West that were fighting, quote, communism in the States really turned their fight to contemporary artists. And there was a period of about a decade where there was just a horrendous conflict between the National Endowment for the Arts and Congress, which has had the effect of really weakening the National Endowment for the Arts, and its funding has been stagnant for 20 years. I think Ai Weiwei is a very important artist. He was not in China. He was in New York during the hard times in China, the 90s, I believe. When Tiananmen Square, I'm trying to remember the date of it, but he was not there. He was not part of the artists in China who struggled and who broke through this impasse before, and got to a point where there was more freedom of expression. He came back then. He was not part of the group that struggled. He's a very, very he's very much in tune with the zeitgeist. He really does feel that, and I think he's very facile about making images that are shocking, that grab attention. I think it's mixed. One of the things I'm hoping to do here is to spend some time thinking and talking to people about what I do next, because I so love working with artists and seeing projects come from them that connect to people and make people think differently. I'm not sure if there's a way to do that going forward, because it's hard to do it not being attached to an institution, although there are lots of freelance people that do it. I also am thinking about the possibility of doing part-time teaching and working to also try to bring students into contact with the artistic process, because I think there's just something so exhilarating about helping things be born that are new ideas, new forms, new ways of looking at the world. Yes, well, first of all, when you go there, if you can let yourself just drift and sit in the courtyard and let yourself experience the beauty of the garden, the ancient sculpture, the Venetian architecture. It's a place where you're supposed to feel rather than think, and that the founder actually was quite a genius, because she was trying to set up a way where people could just experience their senses and not be in the analytic mode of judgment and quantifying and categorizing. So if you can just and then just roam around and just look at a few things. I mean, when people go to museums and think they have to look at everything, it's crazy. When you go to a library, you don't think you have to read every book. But, if you're really looking at a painting or a sculpture, you could spend an hour just looking at one thing if you're really, really looking at it. And so I try to encourage people just to pick a few things to look at and talk to and let speak to you.